The morning mist hung low over the small logging town of Cedar Ridge, Oregon, clinging to the towering Douglas firs like a shroud of silver silk. It was the kind of morning where the air tasted of pine needles and earth, where the distant rumble of logging trucks echoed through the valleys, like the heartbeat of a community built on timber and hard work. But on this particular October morning, something was terribly wrong. 8-year-old Marcus Thompson had vanished into the forest alone, and what 35 lumberjacks would do in the hours that followed would leave this tight-knit town forever changed. This is a story about unlikely heroes, about the power of community, and about how sometimes the people society overlooks become the very ones who remind us what humanity truly means. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you enjoy heartfelt content like this, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope and humanity to your screen. Now, let's continue. Marcus had been in the foster care system since he was 3 years old. His biological mother, overwhelmed by addiction and circumstances she couldn't control, had made the heartbreaking decision to surrender him to Child Protective Services. She had believed in her broken way that she was giving him a chance at something better. For 5 years, Marcus had bounced between 7 different foster homes. Some had been kind enough, families doing their best with limited resources and even more limited training. Others had been places where he learned to make himself small, to stay quiet, to disappear into corners where no one would notice him. The Hendersons were his current placement. Carol and Robert Henderson had taken in foster children for nearly 15 years, supplementing their income in a town where good-paying jobs were increasingly hard to find. They weren't cruel people, not exactly, but they were tired. Tired of children who came and went, tired of paperwork and home visits, tired of investing their hearts in kids who would eventually be moved somewhere else. Marcus had learned quickly that in the Henderson home the best strategy was invisibility. He did his chores without being asked, kept his small room immaculately clean, and never, ever asked for anything beyond what was absolutely necessary. But children, no matter how hard they try to shrink themselves, still have needs that cannot be suppressed forever. The trouble had started 3 days before that misty October morning. Marcus had been sitting in the school cafeteria, eating the free lunch that he carefully tried to make last as long as possible, when Tommy Brennan had walked over with his usual group of followers. Tommy was the kind of boy who had been given everything and appreciated nothing. His father owned the largest remaining independent logging operation in Cedar Ridge, and Tommy wore that privilege like a crown. He had new clothes every season, the latest sneakers, and a cruelty that came from never having faced real consequences for anything. "Hey, foster freak," Tommy had said, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "My dad says your real mom was a druggie, says that's why nobody wants you. Is it true you've lived in like 10 different houses because everyone keeps throwing you back?" Marcus had kept his eyes on his food, his small hands gripping the edge of the plastic tray until his knuckles went white. He had learned that responding only made things worse. He had learned that tears were a currency bullies fed on. He had learned to swallow everything down into a hard, cold place deep in his chest. But Tommy hadn't been satisfied with silence. He had reached down and flipped Marcus's tray, sending the meager lunch splattering across the table and onto Marcus's only pair of school pants. "Oops," Tommy had said, grinning. "Guess foster kids can't even hold on to their food, kind of like how they can't hold on to their families." The laughter that followed had burrowed into Marcus like splinters under his skin. That night, Marcus had made the mistake of asking Carol Henderson if he could have new pants. The ones he was wearing had a stain that wouldn't come out, no matter how hard he had scrubbed them in the bathroom sink with hand soap. Carol had looked at him with that expression he had come to know well, the one that said he was a burden, an obligation, a problem to be managed rather than a child to be loved. You have 2 pairs of pants, Marcus. That's what the state provides funds for. If you can't take care of your things, that's not my problem to solve. But Mrs. Henderson, I didn't. Enough. I don't want to hear excuses. Robert and I have our own bills to pay. Do you think money grows on trees? Marcus had nodded, retreating to his small room at the back of the house. He had sat on his narrow bed, looking out the window at the dark silhouette of the forest that rose behind the Henderson property like a wall of shadows. The trees had seemed to whisper to him in the wind, and for the first time in his young life, Marcus had thought about running. The idea had taken root over the following days, growing stronger each time Tommy found new ways to humiliate him, each time Carol sighed when he entered a room, each time Robert looked through him as if he were made of glass. Marcus had started to believe what everyone seemed to be telling him, in words and in silence, that he was unwanted, that he was a burden, that the world would be better off if he simply disappeared. The morning of October 15th had been colder than usual. Marcus had woken before dawn, his breath visible in the unheated back room. He had lain there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the Henderson house coming to life. Robert's heavy footsteps in the hall, Carol's voice complaining about something, the rush of water through old pipes. He had made his decision. Marcus had dressed quietly, putting on both pairs of pants for warmth and his thin jacket that had already been too small when he received it. He had taken his backpack, the same one he had carried through 7 foster homes, and packed it with the only things that were truly his. A photograph of his mother that a social worker had given him years ago, a small stuffed bear missing one eye that he had named Button, and a notebook filled with stories he had written in the margins of his homework. Marcus had crept down the stairs while the Hendersons were arguing in the kitchen about something unrelated to him. He had slipped out the back door, crossed the overgrown yard, and disappeared into the tree line before the sun had fully risen. The forest had swallowed him whole. What Marcus didn't know, couldn't know, was that his disappearance would set in motion a series of events that would test the very soul of Cedar Ridge and reveal heroes in the most unexpected of places. Carol Henderson didn't notice Marcus was gone until nearly 10 in the morning when the school called to report his absence. At first, she had assumed he was hiding somewhere in the house, avoiding school for some reason. She had searched the rooms with growing irritation, calling his name with the sharp edge of someone whose patience had long since run out. It was Robert who found the back door unlocked, who noticed the small footprints in the frost-covered grass leading toward the forest. For the first time in years, something like genuine concern crossed his weathered face. "Carol!" he had called out, his voice carrying a weight his wife hadn't heard in a long time. I think the boy ran off into the woods. The next hour was a blur of phone calls. Carol called social services to cover herself legally. Robert called the county sheriff's office. By 11 in the morning, a small cluster of official vehicles was parked in the Hendersons' driveway, and the reality of the situation was becoming terrifyingly clear. An 8-year-old boy had fled into thousands of acres of dense Pacific Northwest forest, with nothing but a thin jacket and whatever he had managed to pack. The temperature had been hovering in the low 40s that morning and was expected to drop significantly overnight. Rain was forecast for the evening. Sheriff Daniel Reeves was a man who had seen plenty in his 30 years of law enforcement in rural Oregon. He had handled bar fights and domestic disputes, drug operations and tragic accidents on logging roads. But something about this case hit him differently from the moment he arrived. Maybe it was the way Carol Henderson seemed more concerned about the paperwork than the child. Maybe it was the sight of that small, cold room at the back of the house where Marcus had slept. Maybe it was the single photograph on the nightstand, a faded image of a young woman holding a baby, the only personal item in an otherwise bare space. Sheriff Reeves had a daughter the same age as Marcus, As he stood in that sparse room, he felt something tighten in his chest that he couldn't quite name. "We need to organize a search party," he said to his deputy, his voice brooking no argument, "and we need to do it now." The town of Cedar Ridge had a population of just over 2,000 people. In its heyday, during the logging boom of the 60s and 70s, it had been nearly twice that size. Now it was a community of survivors, people who had stayed when others left, who had adapted when the industry changed, who had found ways to make ends meet when the big companies pulled out. The Brennan Logging Company was one of the last major employers in the area. Frank Brennan had inherited the business from his father and had managed to keep it running through a combination of shrewd business decisions and an iron grip on his workforce. He was not a beloved man, but he was respected in the way that people respect those who sign their paychecks. His son Tommy was another matter entirely. When word spread about the missing foster child, the initial response was mixed. Some people immediately volunteered to help with the search. Others hesitated, remembering that this was the boy who had been living with the Hendersons, that strange, quiet child who always seemed to be looking at something no one else could see. But then something unexpected happened. Big Jim Carver, the foreman at Brennan Logging, heard about the missing boy during the mid-morning break. He was a massive man, standing 6'4", with hands like dinner plates, a full beard that had gone grey at the edges, and a voice that could carry across a clear-cut mountainside. He had worked in the logging industry for 35 years, had raised 4 children of his own, and had buried a wife 2 years ago after a battle with cancer that had nearly broken him. Jim set down his coffee cup and looked around at the crew gathered in the equipment shed. There were 34 other men there, ranging in age from 22 to 63. They were a rough bunch, hardened by physical labor and a life that didn't offer many soft edges. Their hands were calloused, their backs were often sore, and most of them had learned not to expect much from a world that seemed to have forgotten towns like Cedar Ridge. "Any of you hear about that boy that went missing?" Jim asked, his voice cutting through the chatter. The conversations died down. A few men nodded. 8 years old, Jim continued. Foster kid, ran off into the woods this morning. Sheriff's trying to put together a search party, but they don't have the manpower or the know-how to cover that kind of territory. He paused, looking around the shed at the faces of men he had worked alongside for years. Some of them he loved like brothers, others he merely tolerated. But in this moment, looking at each of them in turn, he saw something that the outside world rarely recognized. Good men who had been given precious few opportunities to prove it. "I don't know this boy," Jim said. "Don't know his story beyond what everyone's saying, that he's a foster kid who's been bounced around, that he's quiet and keeps to himself. But I know these woods. We all do. And I know that if that child spends a night out there alone, especially with rain coming, there's a real good chance we're not looking for a rescue anymore. We're looking for a recovery." He let those words hang in the air. "Now, I'm not going to tell any of you what to do. You've all got jobs to do, families to feed, and Frank Brennan isn't exactly known for his understanding nature when it comes to lost work hours. But I'm going to help with that search. And I'm going to do it whether I have company or not." Jim stood up and grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. For a moment, no one moved. Then Charlie Dawson, a wiry man in his 50s who had worked with Jim longer than anyone else, pushed back his chair and reached for his own coat. "Ah, hell," Charlie said. "My back's been killing me anyway. Rather be walking through the woods than hauling equipment." One by one, other men stood. Mike Reiner, whose wife had just had their 3rd baby. Pete Sullivan, who had been trying to save enough money to leave Cedar Ridge for years, but somehow never managed to go. Young Danny Ortiz, barely 23, who had taken the logging job to pay off his mother's medical debts. They all rose, reached for their jackets and gear, and fell in behind Big Jim Carver. Within 10 minutes, all 35 members of the Brennan Logging Company's day crew had made their decision. They walked out of that equipment shed together and drove their trucks down the mountain toward town, leaving several $100,000 worth of machinery sitting idle. None of them knew that this decision would change everything. Frank Brennan was in his office when he heard about the work stoppage. He came out of the trailer that served as company headquarters like a man on fire, his face red with rage, his voice carrying across the yard. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Carver?" he shouted as Jim's truck pulled past. "You can't just walk off the job. There's contracts, there's schedules." Jim stopped his truck and rolled down the window. He looked at his employer of 15 years with an expression that was neither defiant nor apologetic, just resolute. "There's a boy lost in those woods, Frank, an 8-year-old kid. Your own son goes to school with him." Something flickered across Frank Brennan's face at those words, something that might have been discomfort. "That's got nothing to do with—" "It's got everything to do with everything," Jim interrupted quietly. "We'll be back when we find him. You can dock our pay, fire us all if you want. But we're going." He rolled up his window and drove on, followed by a convoy of 34 other trucks. Frank Brennan stood in the empty yard for a long time after they had gone, a strange expression on his face that no one was there to see. The Search Command Center had been set up in the parking lot of Cedar Ridge Community Church, the only space in town large enough to accommodate the growing number of volunteers. When the convoy of logging trucks arrived, Sheriff Reeves felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of fear he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. He approached Big Jim Carver as the massive man climbed out of his vehicle. "Jim, I didn't expect—" "Save it, Danny," Jim said, using the sheriff's first name with the familiarity of someone who had known him since childhood. "Just tell us where you need us." The sheriff spread a topographical map across the hood of his cruiser, pointing out the areas that needed to be covered. The forest behind the Henderson property stretched for miles, a maze of old-growth timber, ravines, seasonal streams, and terrain that could be treacherous even for experienced outdoorsmen. "We've got state search and rescue coming, but they won't be here until late afternoon," Sheriff Reeves explained. "By then, we need to have as much ground covered as possible. The boy's been out there for at least 6 hours already." Jim nodded, studying the map with the practiced eye of someone who had spent his life in these woods. He began dividing his men into teams, pairing the more experienced woodsmen with the younger workers, assigning each group a sector to cover. "We call out every 5 minutes," Jim instructed. "We move slow and thorough, check every hollow, every fallen log, anywhere a scared kid might hide. And for God's sake, if you find him, don't scare him more than he already is. Approach slow, keep your voice gentle. This boy's been through enough." The men dispersed into the forest, their orange safety vests visible through the trees like small flames, flickering in the green darkness. Their calls echoed through the woods. "Marcus! Marcus! Can you hear me?" A chorus of rough voices made gentle by purpose. As the afternoon wore on, the clouds that had been threatening all day began to gather in earnest. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of coming rain. In town, word had spread about what the loggers had done. People who had been on the fence about joining the search began showing up at the church. Shop owners closed their stores. Teachers who had finished their school day drove straight to the command center. Even some of the high school students came, including notably Tommy Brennan. Tommy had been in class when the announcement came over the PA system, asking for any information about Marcus Thompson's whereabouts. He had sat at his desk, a strange churning in his stomach that he couldn't quite identify. He had spent years tormenting that kid, making fun of his clothes, his situation, the fact that nobody wanted him. It had been easy, even fun in a cruel way. Marcus never fought back, never told anyone. He just took it, with those big brown eyes that sometimes seemed to look right through Tommy to something on the other side. Now that kid was lost in the forest, and Tommy couldn't stop thinking about the last thing he had said to him. Guess foster kids can't even hold on to their families. Tommy found his mother at home that afternoon and told her he was going to help with the search. Margaret Brennan, a woman who had spent years trying to soften the edges of both her husband and her son, had simply nodded and driven him to the church herself. "Do something good," she had said quietly as he got out of the car. "For once, Tommy, just do something good." Tommy didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded and walked toward the group of volunteers being organized by a deputy. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Marcus Thompson was struggling to survive. He had walked for hours that morning, putting as much distance as he could between himself and the Henderson house, between himself and the school, between himself and a world that seemed to have no place for him. The trees had closed in around him, the canopy blocking out the weak autumn sun, and before long he had lost all sense of direction. It was mid-afternoon when he finally admitted to himself that he was lost. Marcus found a massive fallen log, an old-growth giant that had toppled years ago, and crawled into the hollow space beneath it. The earth there was damp but not wet, carpeted with decomposing needles that provided a thin layer of insulation. He pressed his back against the curved wood and pulled his knees to his chest, trying to conserve whatever warmth his thin jacket could offer. He was hungry, he was thirsty, he was more scared than he had ever been in his life. But there was also something else, something he hadn't expected. As he sat there in the growing darkness, listening to the forest sounds around him, the creak of branches, the distant call of birds, the whisper of wind through needles, Marcus felt, for the first time in a very long time, a strange sort of peace. No one here expected anything from him. No one was disappointed in him. The forest didn't care that he was a foster kid, didn't care that his mother had given him up, didn't care about his stained pants or his second-hand clothes. The forest simply was, and he was in it, and for this moment at least that was enough. He pulled Button the bear from his backpack and held the worn, stuffed animal close. He thought about his mother, not the faded photograph version, but the warm, hazy memories that sometimes came to him in dreams. The smell of her hair, the sound of her laugh, the feeling of being held by someone who loved him. Marcus didn't cry. He had learned long ago that crying didn't help anything, but he held Button tight and whispered a prayer to anyone who might be listening, anyone who might care about one small boy lost in a very big forest. "Please," he whispered, "please don't let me disappear." By 5 o'clock, the first drops of rain began to fall. The search teams pushed on, their calls growing more urgent as daylight began to fade. Big Jim Carver had been on his feet for hours, his legs aching, his voice growing hoarse, but he refused to stop. He couldn't stop. Every time he considered taking a break, he thought about that small room at the back of the Henderson house, about the single photograph on the nightstand, about what it meant to be a child who had been passed from hand to hand like an unwanted package. His own children had grown up with stability, with love, with the knowledge that they were wanted. It was something he had taken for granted, something most people took for granted. But not every child got that. Not Marcus Thompson. Jim stopped to take a drink from his canteen and wiped the rain from his face. Charlie Dawson appeared at his elbow, his own face lined with exhaustion and something that looked like doubt. "Jim, it's getting dark. Some of the boys are worried about continuing in the rain. If someone gets hurt out here—" "Then we'll deal with it," Jim interrupted. "But we're not leaving that boy out here alone." "I'm not saying we give up. I'm saying maybe we should consolidate, focus on the most likely areas." "Charlie!" Jim turned to face his old friend, and there was something in his eyes that made Charlie fall silent. "When I was 16 years old, I got lost in these woods during a hunting trip. Spent the night out here alone, scared out of my mind, certain I was going to die. It was the longest night of my life, but I was 16. I had a rifle, proper gear, and I knew these woods well enough to stay somewhat oriented. That boy is 8. He's got nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever he could fit in a school backpack. And from what I've heard, he's been made to feel his whole life like he doesn't matter." Jim's voice cracked slightly, and he paused to collect himself. "We're going to find that boy," he continued, "and we're going to show him that he does matter, that people care, that the world isn't just the cold, hard place it's been showing him so far. So no, we're not consolidating. We're not giving up. We're pushing on until we find him, or until we physically can't continue anymore. Is that clear?" Charlie looked at his friend for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Clear as day, Jim, clear as day." As darkness fell over Cedar Ridge, the search took on a different quality. Flashlights and headlamps cut through the rain, creating cones of light that swept across the underbrush. The calls for Marcus continued, echoing through the wet forest like a chorus of hope. In town, the community had mobilized in other ways. The church had been opened, and volunteers were preparing hot food and coffee for the searchers. Blankets had been gathered, dry clothes assembled, first aid supplies organized. Someone had thought to bring Marcus's school photo and had made copies, distributing them to every searcher so they would know exactly who they were looking for. The photograph showed a small boy with dark brown skin, large brown eyes, and close-cropped black hair. He wasn't smiling in the picture. His expression was neutral, guarded, but there was something in those eyes that made people pause when they looked at the image. A depth, a sorrow, a quiet intelligence that seemed too heavy for such a young face. Margaret Brennan had come to the church to help coordinate the volunteer efforts. She moved through the space with quiet efficiency, organizing supplies and offering comfort to the worried parents who had come to help. At one point, she found herself standing next to Carol Henderson, who was sitting alone in a corner, her face pale and drawn. "Mrs. Henderson," Margaret said, sitting down beside her, "can I get you anything, some coffee?" Carol looked up, and Margaret was surprised to see tears on the woman's face. "I didn't know," Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize how bad it had gotten for him. He was so quiet, so self-sufficient. He never asked for anything, never complained. I thought that meant he was fine." Margaret didn't know what to say to that. She thought about her own son, about all the times she had looked the other way when Tommy had been cruel, all the times she had made excuses for his behavior. She thought about how easy it was to miss the damage being done when you weren't the one receiving it. "Children learn to hide their pain," Margaret said finally. "They learn what's expected of them and they adapt. It doesn't mean they're not hurting. It just means they've stopped believing anyone will help." Carol broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands. Margaret put an arm around her shoulder and held her. Two imperfect women confronting the imperfect ways they had failed the children in their care. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Marcus was cold, colder than he had ever been in his life. The rain had found its way through every gap in his hiding place, soaking through his thin jacket and both pairs of pants. He was shivering uncontrollably now, his teeth chattering so hard that his jaw ached. He had pulled Button inside his jacket, pressing the worn stuffed animal against his chest in a futile attempt to share warmth. He could hear things in the forest, sounds that his mind transformed into monsters and threats. A branch snapping became a predator stalking him. The wind through the trees became voices whispering his failures. He was so tired, but he was afraid to sleep, afraid that if he closed his eyes, he might never open them again. And yet, somewhere beneath the fear and the cold and the exhaustion, there was still that small flame of peace he had found earlier. The world had shown him so little kindness, but the forest, even in its harshness, was not cruel. It was simply nature, following its own laws, indifferent to the concerns of one small boy. There was a strange comfort in that indifference. Marcus found himself talking to Button, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Do you think anyone's looking for us?" he asked. Maybe they are. Maybe someone noticed we're gone. Mrs. Henderson will be mad about the mess in the kitchen. I forgot to do my dishes before I left." He laughed, a small, sad sound that was swallowed by the darkness. "Maybe Mom is looking for us, up in heaven or wherever people go. Maybe she can see us right now and she's worried. Do you think she worries about me, Button? Do you think she ever thinks about me?" He pressed his face against the worn fabric of the bear, feeling the familiar comfort of something that had been with him through every foster home, every midnight move, every painful goodbye. "I'm sorry I ran away," he whispered. "I just wanted to stop feeling like this, like I'm always in the way, like nobody really wants me around. I thought maybe if I disappeared, everyone would be happier. But now I'm scared, Button. I'm really, really scared." The rain intensified, drumming against the fallen log like 1,000 tiny fingers. Marcus curled tighter into himself, trying to make his body as small as possible, trying to conserve whatever warmth remained. He was starting to drift, his mind fuzzy at the edges, when he heard something that made him snap back to alertness. A voice, distant but definitely human. "Marcus, Marcus, can you hear me?" For a moment, Marcus was certain he was imagining it. The forest had been playing tricks on him all night, turning every sound into something either terrifying or hopeful. But then the voice came again, closer this time, and there was no mistaking it. "Marcus, if you can hear me, call out. We're here to help." Marcus tried to respond, but his voice came out as barely a croak. His throat was raw from cold and thirst, his lips cracked and dry. He tried again, forcing sound through his chattering teeth. "Here," he managed. "I'm here." But the wind snatched his words away, carrying them off into the darkness. The voices seemed to be moving away now, the searchers following a different path. Panic rose in Marcus's chest. They were going to miss him. They were so close, and they were going to walk right past without knowing he was there. With tremendous effort, Marcus pushed himself out from under the fallen log. His legs were stiff and unresponsive, his whole body shaking so violently that he could barely stand. But he forced himself upright, leaning against the massive trunk for support. "I'm here!" he screamed, putting every ounce of remaining strength into his voice. "Please, I'm here!" The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then through the rain and darkness, Marcus saw it, a beam of light swinging toward him through the trees. "I heard something," a voice shouted. "Over this way!" More lights appeared, converging on his position. Marcus stood there, swaying on his feet, watching the lights approach like stars falling from the sky. He was crying now, tears mixing with the rain on his face. But he didn't care. He didn't care about anything except the fact that someone had heard him, someone had come. Big Jim Carver was the first to reach him. The massive logger burst through the underbrush, his flashlight sweeping across the scene until it landed on the small figure standing beside the fallen log. Jim stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. Marcus looked like a ghost, pale, soaked, trembling so hard he could barely stand. His eyes were huge in his thin face, and he was clutching something against his chest. A stuffed bear, Jim realized, missing one eye, its fur matted and worn. "Hey there, son," Jim said softly, keeping his voice as gentle as he could manage. "My name's Jim. We've been looking for you." Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. His legs finally gave way beneath him, and he started to crumple toward the ground. Jim was there in an instant, catching the boy before he could fall, wrapping his massive frame around that small, shivering body. "I've got you," Jim said, his own voice cracking with emotion. "I've got you now. You're safe." Marcus buried his face against Jim's chest, and for the first time in years, he let himself cry. Not the silent, hidden tears he had learned to shed in the darkness of foster home bedrooms, but real, sobbing cries that shook his entire body. "I'm sorry," he gasped between sobs. "I'm sorry I ran away. I didn't mean to cause trouble. Please don't be mad." Jim held him tighter, his own tears mixing with the rain. "You didn't cause any trouble, son. Not a bit. We're just glad we found you. That's all that matters." The other searchers were arriving now, their flashlights creating a circle of light around Jim and Marcus. Charlie Dawson was there, and Pete Sullivan, and young Danny Ortiz. They stood in the rain, watching this moment, and not one of them was ashamed of the tears on their faces. Jim unzipped his own heavy jacket and wrapped it around Marcus, adding his body heat to the insufficient warmth. He produced a thermos from his pack, coffee laced with sugar, and helped Marcus take small sips. "We need to get him back," Jim said to the others. "He's hypothermic. Charlie, radio ahead to the church. Tell them to have warm blankets ready and get someone to call for an ambulance just in case." Charlie was already on his radio, his voice thick with relief. "Base, this is Search Team Alpha. We found him. Repeat, we found him. He's alive." The response that came back was nearly drowned out by cheering. The journey back to civilization was slow and careful. Jim carried Marcus the entire way, refusing offers to share the burden. The boy had fallen into an exhausted half-sleep, his face pressed against Jim's shoulder, his small hands still clutching Button the bear. As they walked, Jim talked to him, a low, steady stream of words that were meant to comfort and reassure. "You know, I got lost in these same woods when I was a kid, scared the living daylights out of me, but I made it through, and so did you. You're stronger than you know, Marcus, a lot stronger." He told the boy about his own children, about his daughter who loved to read and his son who played baseball. He told him about working in the forest, about the satisfaction of honest labor and the beauty of watching the sunrise over the mountains. He told him about things that had nothing to do with foster care or loneliness or feeling unwanted, just ordinary, everyday things that painted a picture of a life that was stable and safe. By the time they emerged from the tree line, a crowd had gathered at the edge of the Henderson property. There were cheers and applause, but Jim barely noticed. His attention was focused entirely on getting Marcus to safety. An ambulance was waiting, its lights flashing red and blue against the darkness. Paramedics rushed forward with thermal blankets and medical equipment. Jim reluctantly handed Marcus over to them, but he didn't go far. "I want to stay with him," Jim said to the paramedic, until someone from the foster system gets here." The paramedic, a young woman with kind eyes, nodded without hesitation. "Of course, we could use someone to keep him calm anyway." Inside the ambulance, Marcus was stripped of his wet clothes and wrapped in heated blankets. An IV was started to replace fluids, and monitors were attached to track his vital signs. Through it all, Jim sat nearby, his presence a steady anchor. Marcus's eyes fluttered open, searching until they found Jim's face. "You stayed," he said, his voice small and wondering. "Of course I stayed. I'm not going anywhere." "Why?" The question was so simple, so innocent, and so heartbreaking. Jim reached out and took Marcus's small hand in his own massive one. "Because you matter, son. Because your life has value and people care about you. I know the world hasn't always shown you that, but it's true. Look at how many people came out tonight to find you. 35 of my crew alone. And that's not counting everyone else. All of them walking through the rain and the dark, calling your name, because you matter." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this man could be trusted, whether these words could be believed. "I don't understand," he finally said. "Nobody's ever done anything like that for me before." "Then it was long overdue," Jim said firmly, "and I'm sorry it took so long, but I promise you, Marcus, from this moment on, things are going to be different. I don't know exactly how yet, but I'm going to make sure of it." It was a promise made in the back of an ambulance, in the early hours of a rainy October morning, between a rough logger and a lost foster child, but it was a promise Jim Carver intended to keep. The ambulance arrived at Cedar Ridge Memorial Hospital shortly after midnight. Marcus was taken to the emergency room for evaluation, where doctors determined that while he was mildly hypothermic and dehydrated, there was no lasting physical damage. He was warmed, hydrated, and given something to eat, the first real meal he had had in nearly 24 hours. Through it all, Big Jim stayed with him, just as he had promised. The hospital waiting room, meanwhile, had become the unofficial gathering place for the community. Loggers in their mud-caked boots sat alongside teachers and shop owners. Parents who had helped with the search stood in small groups, talking quietly. Even some of the high school students were there, including Tommy Brennan, who sat alone in a corner, looking like he was wrestling with something heavy. Sheriff Reeves moved through the room, thanking people for their help. When he reached Jim's crew, he shook each man's hand personally. "What you men did tonight," the sheriff said, his voice gruff with emotion, "that was something special. You should be proud." Charlie Dawson shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "We just did what anyone would do," he said. "No," the sheriff replied. "You did what too few people actually do. There's a difference." Around 2 in the morning, a social worker arrived from the county office in Medford. Her name was Patricia Williams, and she had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much sadness in her career. She spoke briefly with the hospital staff, then asked to see Marcus. Jim stood up from his chair in the corner of Marcus's room. "I'd like to stay, if that's all right," he said. "The boy's been through a lot. It might help to have a familiar face around." Patricia looked at him with surprise, and then something that might have been gratitude. "You're Mr. Carver, the one who found him?" "I'm one of them. It was a team effort." Patricia nodded slowly. "I've heard what you and your men did tonight. The entire county's heard. You can stay." She approached Marcus's bed, pulling up a chair so she could sit at his level. "Hi, Marcus. I'm Patricia. I'm a social worker, which I know probably doesn't fill you with joy, but I need to talk to you about what happened and about what comes next. Is that okay?" Marcus looked at Jim, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Okay," Marcus said quietly. The conversation that followed was gentle but thorough. Patricia asked about the Henderson home, about school, about what had led Marcus to run into the forest. Marcus answered honestly, his voice gaining strength as he realized that this woman seemed genuinely interested in his answers, not just checking boxes on a form. When he told her about Tommy Brennan's bullying, about the stained pants, about Carol Henderson's response to his request for help, Patricia's expression remained neutral, but Jim saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Marcus," Patricia said when he had finished, "I want you to know that what happened to you wasn't okay. The way you were treated at school, at the Henderson home, none of that was your fault. You deserved better, and the adults in your life failed you. I'm sorry for that." Marcus's eyes widened. In all his years in the system, no one had ever apologized to him before. "What happens now?" he asked. Patricia sighed. "Well, we need to find you a new placement. The Henderson home is no longer an appropriate option. Unfortunately, there's a shortage of foster families in this area, so in the short term, you might need to stay at a group facility in Medford until we can—" "No." The word came from Jim, and it carried such quiet force that both Patricia and Marcus turned to look at him. "What do you mean, no?" Patricia asked carefully. Jim stepped forward, his massive frame filling the small hospital room. "I mean, he's not going to some group home in another city, surrounded by strangers, after everything he's been through. There has to be another option." "Mr. Carver, I appreciate your concern, but the foster care system has processes—" "Then let's work within those processes," Jim interrupted. "What would it take for me to become his foster parent?" The room went silent. Marcus stared at Jim with an expression of such raw hope and disbelief that it nearly broke the big man's heart. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing this unexpected development. "You're serious," she finally said. "As serious as I've ever been about anything in my life." "Mr. Carver, Becoming a foster parent isn't a simple process. There are background checks, home studies, training requirements. Then let's start them, tonight if possible. You don't even know this child. You met him a few hours ago. Jim looked at Marcus, at those big brown eyes that had seen too much hardship for their years, at the worn stuffed bear still clutched in the boy's arms. I know enough, Jim said quietly. I know he's been failed by everyone who was supposed to protect him. I know he ran into the forest because he felt like he had no other choice. And I know that right now, at this moment, I have a chance to do something that actually matters. If you tell me I can't foster him, fine, but I'm not walking away from this boy. Whatever role I can play in his life, I want to play it. Patricia studied him for a long time, her experienced eyes seeing things that others might miss. She saw a man who was rough around the edges, but genuine in his conviction. She saw someone who had known loss. There was something in his eyes that spoke of grief, but who had come through it without becoming bitter. She saw, perhaps most importantly, someone who was willing to fight for a child he had only just met. There's an emergency placement provision, she said slowly. In situations where a child is at immediate risk and a suitable temporary guardian is available, we can expedite certain aspects of the process. It would still require a preliminary background check and a home visit, but if everything checks out, we could potentially place Marcus with you within 48 hours. Do it, Jim said without hesitation. Patricia turned to Marcus. What do you think about all this, sweetheart? This is ultimately your decision too. Marcus looked at Jim, really looked at him, taking in the weathered face, the kind eyes, the massive hands that had carried him so gently through the forest. You really want me? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Even though you just met me? Even though you're what? Jim asked softly. Marcus swallowed hard. Even though I'm difficult to place, that's what they say about me, difficult to place. Jim crossed the room and knelt beside Marcus's bed so they were at eye level. Marcus, listen to me carefully. You are not difficult. You are a child who has been through more hard times than most adults ever face, and you've survived with your heart intact. That's not difficult. That's remarkable. That's brave. And if you'll have me, I'd be honored to be part of your life. Marcus's lower lip trembled. What if you change your mind? What if you decide you don't want me either? I'm not going to lie to you and pretend I have all the answers, Jim said honestly. I've never been a foster parent before. I'll probably make mistakes, but I can promise you this. I don't give up on things that matter, and you matter. So whatever comes, we'll figure it out together. Deal? Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he extended his small hand. Deal, he whispered. Jim took the offered hand and shook it gently, and something passed between them in that moment, a connection forged in crisis and sealed with a promise. Patricia Williams watched this exchange with tears in her eyes that she quickly blinked away. She had been doing this job for 17 years, and moments like this, genuine moments of grace and humanity, were rare, but they were also the reason she kept going. All right, she said, her voice slightly unsteady, let's make this happen. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Jim's background check came back clean, not surprising for a man whose only brush with the law had been a speeding ticket 15 years ago. His home, a modest 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, was examined by a social worker who noted its cleanliness, its warmth, and the way family photographs covered nearly every wall. You were married? The social worker asked, noting a wedding photo on the mantel. 32 years, Jim replied. Lost her to cancer 2 years back. I'm sorry. Thank you. She was the best person I ever knew. She would have loved this, taking in a child who needed help. It was always something she wanted to do, but we never got around to it. Life got in the way. Well, the social worker said, making a note on her clipboard. "It seems like you're getting around to it now." Meanwhile, the town of Cedar Ridge was buzzing with news about what had happened. The story of the foster child who had run into the forest and the 35 loggers who had walked off their jobs to find him had spread far beyond the county lines. A reporter from the Medford Mail Tribune had picked it up, and then a station in Portland, and before long, news trucks were appearing on the outskirts of town. Jim refused all interview requests. "This isn't about publicity," he told one persistent reporter. "This is about a boy who deserves a chance at a normal life. He doesn't need cameras in his face." But the attention, unwanted as it was, had unexpected benefits. On the second day after the rescue, Frank Brennan appeared at Jim's door. The logging company owner stood on the porch, looking uncomfortable, his usual bluster notably absent. "Can I come in?" he asked. Jim studied his employer for a moment, then stepped aside. They sat in Jim's small kitchen, two men who had worked together for 15 years but had never really known each other. Frank accepted a cup of coffee and stared into it like it contained the answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "I'm not going to fire you," Frank finally said, "or any of the others. I wanted you to know that." "Appreciated," Jim replied neutrally. "That's not—" Frank stopped, took a breath. "That's not why I came. I came because my son told me some things last night. Things about how he's been treating that foster boy. Things I should have known about, should have paid attention to, but didn't." He looked up, and Jim was surprised to see genuine shame in the man's eyes. "I've spent so much time building this company, trying to keep it alive when everyone said small operations like ours couldn't survive. I told myself I was doing it for my family, for Tommy's future. But somewhere along the way, I stopped paying attention to who Tommy was becoming, and he became someone who hurts kids weaker than him to feel powerful." Frank's voice cracked slightly. "That's on me. That's my failure as a father. And I don't know how to fix it, but I know it has to change." Jim was quiet for a moment, absorbing this unexpected confession. "What are you going to do about it?" he finally asked. "I don't know yet. Counseling, maybe. Actually spending time with him instead of just throwing money at whatever he wants. And I'm going to make him apologize to that boy, Marcus, personally. Not because it'll make anything right, but because he needs to start understanding that his actions have consequences." Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, which he slid across the table to Jim. "There's something else. The company's setting up a fund for the foster care system in this county. It's not enough to fix everything, nothing is, but it's a start. And I wanted you to know that you and your men will be getting a bonus this year for what you did." Jim pushed the envelope back across the table. "Keep your bonus. We didn't do it for money." "I know. That's exactly why you deserve it." The two men looked at each other and something shifted between them. Not quite friendship, but perhaps the beginning of mutual respect. "How's the boy doing?" Frank asked. "He's strong, stronger than he knows. He'll be okay, I think, eventually." "And you're really going through with this? Fostering him?" "Already done. Signed the papers this morning. He's coming home with me tomorrow." Frank nodded slowly. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for, Jim." "I'm just a man trying to do right by a kid who needs it," Jim replied. "Nothing better about it, just decent." Frank stood to leave, but stopped at the door. "For what it's worth, I hope it works out, for both of you." "Thanks, Frank." After he left, Jim sat alone in his kitchen for a long time, thinking about the strange turns life could take, about the way crisis could reveal the best and worst in people, about the child who would be coming to live with him tomorrow. He was terrified, more terrified than he had been walking into that dark forest, searching for a boy he didn't even know. Taking on the responsibility for another human being's life and well-being, that was something else entirely. But beneath the fear was something else, purpose. For 2 years, since Ellen had died, Jim had been going through the motions of life without really living. He worked, he ate, he slept. He saw his grown children when they visited and called them on Sundays, but there had been a hollowness at the center of everything, a missing piece that he hadn't known how to fill. Maybe this was how it would be filled, not by forgetting Ellen or replacing her, but by doing something she would have been proud of, by opening his home and his heart to a child who needed both. "Well, Ellen," he said to the empty kitchen, "looks like we're finally getting around to it. Wish you were here to help me figure out how." He could almost hear her response, that gentle laugh, that quiet confidence that had always steadied him. "You'll figure it out, Jimmy. You always do." The day Marcus came home to Jim's house was overcast, but dry, a small mercy after the rain that had fallen almost continuously since his rescue. Jim had spent the morning preparing, making sure the spare bedroom was ready, stocking the refrigerator with food he hoped a child would eat, trying to remember everything his own kids had liked when they were Marcus's age. Patricia Williams arrived at the hospital to handle the official transfer. Marcus was discharged with instructions for rest and hydration, though physically he had recovered remarkably well. The resilience of children, the doctor had remarked, was an amazing thing. Marcus walked out of the hospital, holding Button in one arm and Jim's hand in the other. He was wearing new clothes, donations that had poured in from the community, and his eyes were wide as he took in the small crowd that had gathered outside. Many of the loggers were there. Charlie Dawson, who had tears streaming down his weathered face, Pete Sullivan, who had brought his own kids to witness this moment, young Danny Ortiz, who gave Marcus a small wave and a smile. They had all come to see the beginning of something they had helped make possible. And they weren't alone. Teachers from Marcus's school had come, along with parents and community members who had participated in the search. Even some of the shop owners who had closed their stores that night were there, standing in quiet solidarity. Marcus pressed closer to Jim, overwhelmed by the attention. "It's okay," Jim said softly. "They're not here to stare at you. They're here because they care about you. They want to see that you're all right." "All these people care about me?" Marcus asked, disbelief coloring his voice. "All these people and more. You'd be amazed how many lives you touched just by surviving." They made their way to Jim's truck, accepting handshakes and well wishes along the way. When they finally pulled out of the hospital parking lot, Marcus was quiet for a long time, watching the town pass by outside the window. "Mr. Carver," he finally said, "you can call me Jim, or—" He paused, uncertain how to navigate this, "whatever feels comfortable for you." "Jim," Marcus said, testing the name. "Where are we going?" "Home," Jim said simply. "We're going home." They drove through Cedar Ridge, past the lumber yard where Jim worked, past the elementary school where Marcus had spent so many lonely days, past the Henderson house that sat dark and silent on its corner lot. Marcus stared at that house as they passed, but said nothing. Jim's place was at the end of a long gravel road, backed up against the edge of the forest. It was a simple house. Wood siding, covered porch, smoke curling from the chimney where Jim had started a fire that morning. Beyond it, the trees rose in their ancient majesty, no longer threatening but simply present, keeping their eternal watch. "It's not much," Jim said as they pulled into the driveway, "but it's warm and dry and there's plenty of room." Marcus stared at the house with an expression Jim couldn't quite read. "It's beautiful," the boy finally said. They went inside together, and Jim gave Marcus a tour of what would now be his home, the living room with its worn but comfortable furniture and the fireplace crackling warmly, the kitchen, which Jim apologized was not as neat as it probably should be, the bathroom where Marcus would have his own towels and toiletries, and finally the bedroom at the end of the hall. Jim had done his best to make it welcoming. The bed had new sheets and a thick quilt. There was a desk by the window for homework, and a bookshelf that Jim had filled with books he thought an 8-year-old might enjoy. On the nightstand, in a simple wooden frame, was the photograph from Marcus's old room, the faded image of a young woman holding a baby. Marcus stopped short when he saw it.
How did you...
Patricia brought it over yesterday, Jim explained. I figured you'd want to have it somewhere you could see it. Marcus walked to the nightstand and picked up the photograph carefully, as if it might crumble in his hands. That's my mom, he said quietly. She's the only one who ever really loved me. Jim sat down on the edge of the bed, giving Marcus space, but staying close enough to be present. Tell me about her, he said. And Marcus did. He told Jim about the warm, hazy memories from before he entered foster care, about how his mother used to sing to him at night, songs he could barely remember now except for the feeling of them, about how she would hold him when he cried and tell him that everything would be okay, about how, even though she had given him up, he knew that she had done it because she loved him and wanted something better for him. Jim listened without interrupting, without judging, and when Marcus was done, when the words had run out and the tears had come and gone, Jim simply put his hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "She would be proud of you, Marcus, proud of how strong you are, how brave, and I'm going to do my best to take care of you the way she would have wanted." Marcus looked up at him with those old soul eyes. "Promise?" he asked. "I promise." The weeks that followed were not easy. Adjusting to each other took time and patience on both sides. Marcus had nightmares, terrible dreams, where he was lost in the forest again, where the voices calling for him grew distant and then silent, where the cold crept in and he couldn't feel his body anymore. Jim learned to listen for the sounds of distress in the night, to go to Marcus's room and sit with him until the trembling stopped and sleep returned. There were also practical challenges to navigate. Jim's work schedule had to be adjusted to accommodate Marcus's school hours. There were meetings with teachers, with social workers, with therapists who were helping Marcus process his trauma. There were meals to prepare, homework to supervise, and the countless small negotiations that come with sharing a home with another person. But there were good moments too. More than good. There were moments that made Jim feel like maybe, just maybe, he was getting this right. The first time Marcus laughed at one of Jim's terrible jokes, the first time he called the house home without hesitation, the first time he fell asleep on the couch during a movie night, trusting enough to let his guard down completely. And then there was the Saturday morning, about 3 weeks after Marcus came to live with him, when Jim woke up to find the boy standing in his bedroom doorway, an uncertain expression on his face. "Oh, what's up, buddy?" Jim asked, sitting up and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Marcus was quiet for a moment, wrestling with something internal. "I was wondering," he finally said, if maybe I could call you something other than Jim." Jim's heart contracted in his chest. What did you have in mind? Another long pause, and then so quietly Jim almost missed it. "Dad?" In all his years of logging, Jim had faced down falling trees, malfunctioning equipment, and conditions that could kill a man in minutes. But nothing had ever hit him as hard as that single, whispered word from an 8-year-old boy who had never had a father to call his own. He got out of bed and crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees so he could look Marcus in the eye. "I would be honored," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing would make me happier." Marcus's face broke into the first real, full smile Jim had ever seen on him. "Okay," he said, "Dad." And just like that, everything changed. The town of Cedar Ridge watched this transformation with something like wonder. People who had never paid much attention to the quiet foster boy now saw him walking through town with Big Jim Carver, the massive logger who had become an unlikely father figure. They saw the way Marcus was slowly coming out of his shell, the way he smiled more often, the way he held his head a little higher. The loggers of Brennan Logging took a particular interest in Marcus's well-being. They took turns picking him up from school when Jim was working late. They came to his little league games when spring arrived and Jim signed him up for the team. They became a collection of rough, gruff uncles who doted on him in their own awkward ways. Charlie Dawson taught Marcus how to whittle, producing a collection of lopsided animals that Marcus treasured. Pete Sullivan helped him with math homework, discovering in the process that the boy was remarkably bright when given the chance to show it. Young Danny Ortiz, who had never had a kid brother, took Marcus under his wing with an enthusiasm that touched everyone who witnessed it. But the most surprising transformation came from an unexpected source: Tommy Brennan. True to his word, Frank Brennan had required his son to apologize to Marcus personally. It had been an awkward, uncomfortable encounter, with Tommy clearly struggling to find words for something he had never had to do before. "I'm sorry," Tommy had finally managed, not meeting Marcus's eyes, "for everything, for the things I said, the way I treated you. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry." Marcus had studied him for a long moment, this boy who had made his life miserable for so long. He thought about all the cruel words, all the humiliations, all the times he had wished he could just disappear. "Why did you do it?" Marcus asked. Tommy looked up, surprised by the question. "I don't know," he admitted. I guess I was angry about stuff that had nothing to do with you, and you were an easy target. You never fought back, never told anyone. It made me feel powerful, picking on someone weaker than me. But that's not an excuse. There is no excuse." Marcus considered this. He thought about what Jim had told him about people, that everyone was fighting battles others couldn't see, that cruelty usually came from a place of pain or fear, that forgiveness was a gift you gave yourself as much as the person who had wronged you. "Okay," Marcus finally said. "Okay," Tommy repeated, confused. "I'm not saying we're friends. I'm not saying what you did was okay, but I'm not going to carry it around with me anymore. Life's too short for that." Tommy stared at him, and something like respect flickered across his face. "You're different than I thought," he said. "No," Marcus replied. "You just never bothered to actually look." It wasn't the beginning of a friendship. Some wounds run too deep for that, but it was the end of hostility. Tommy, under his father's watchful eye and with the help of a family counselor, began the long process of becoming a different kind of person. And Marcus, freed from the weight of their toxic dynamic, was able to focus on building the life he had never dared to dream of. Spring turned to summer, and Marcus flourished in ways no one had anticipated. His grades improved dramatically. He made friends at school, real friends, who invited him to birthday parties and wanted to hear his opinion on things. He discovered a love of reading, devouring books from the library and from the shelves Jim had filled in his room. But the most remarkable change was in his relationship with Jim, or Dad, as he now called him, without hesitation. They developed routines and rituals that became the architecture of their shared life. Pancake breakfasts on Saturday mornings, fishing trips to the river that ran behind the property, movie nights on Sundays, where they worked their way through Jim's collection of classic westerns. Evening walks through the forest, where the trees that had once seemed so threatening now felt like old friends. One evening in July, as they sat on the back porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Marcus asked the question that had been sitting in his heart for months. Dad, are you going to adopt me?" Jim set down his coffee mug and turned to face his foster son. "Is that something you want?" Marcus nodded, his expression earnest. "I know I've only been here a little while, and I know the adoption process is complicated, but I was just wondering if you'd thought about it." Jim reached over and took Marcus's hand. "Marcus, I've thought about almost nothing else for the past 3 months. I've been working with Patricia and a lawyer to get the process started. If everything goes well, we could finalize by Christmas. Marcus's eyes went wide. Really? Really? I was going to tell you soon, but I wanted to make sure everything was on track first. I didn't want to get your hopes up and then have something fall through. So I'd be your son, like for real, forever? For real and forever, Jim confirmed, if that's what you want. Marcus launched himself at Jim, wrapping his arms around the big man's neck in a fierce hug. It's what I want, he said, his voice muffled against Jim's shoulder. It's all I've ever wanted. They stayed like that for a long time, father and son, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. The adoption was finalized on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas. The courthouse in Medford was usually a place of tense proceedings and legal battles, but on that winter morning it was filled with a different energy entirely. The courtroom was packed with people who had come to witness this moment. The loggers from Brennan Logging, teachers from Marcus's school, Patricia Williams and the other social workers who had guided this journey, and members of the Cedar Ridge community who had become invested in this story. Marcus wore a new suit that Jim had bought for the occasion. He looked uncomfortable in it. He was much more at home in jeans and boots now, but he understood the importance of the day and bore it with good grace. Jim wore his own suit, pulled from the back of his closet where it had hung since Ellen's funeral. It still fit, more or less, and it felt right to wear it for this new beginning. The judge, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Coleman, looked out at the crowded courtroom with an expression of barely contained emotion. In my 23 years on the bench, she said, I have presided over many adoptions. Each one is special, but I must admit, this case has touched me in ways I did not expect. She looked down at Marcus, who was standing beside Jim at the front of the courtroom. Marcus, I've read your file. I know the challenges you've faced, the instability you've endured, the ways in which the system that was supposed to protect you has sometimes let you down. And yet, here you stand, a remarkable young man who has shown more resilience and grace than many adults I've encountered. She turned to Jim. And Mr. Carver, Jim, what you and your colleagues did that night in October, walking into a dark forest in the rain to find a child you had never met, that was an act of extraordinary humanity. But what you've done since then has been even more remarkable. You've opened your home and your heart to a child who desperately needed both. You've shown him what it means to be part of a family. That is a gift beyond measure. Judge Coleman picked up her gavel. It is with great pleasure that I hereby finalize the adoption of Marcus Thompson by James Carver. From this day forward, Marcus will legally be known as Marcus James Carver, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted in applause. Marcus turned to Jim, to his father, with tears streaming down his face. I'm really yours now? He asked. You were always mine, Jim replied, his own eyes wet. This just makes it official. They embraced. And around them, the community that had come together to save one small boy celebrated the beautiful new chapter that had begun. Later that evening, there was a party at the Cedar Ridge Community Church, the same place that had served as the command center for the search, now transformed into a space of celebration. Tables groaned with food that people had brought from all over town. Children ran between the legs of adults, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. The loggers had set up in one corner, telling increasingly embellished stories about the night of the search. Marcus moved through the crowd with a new confidence, accepting congratulations and hugs with an ease that would have been impossible just months ago. He was still quiet by nature, still thoughtful and observant, but the haunted look that had once lived in his eyes had faded, replaced by something that looked remarkably like happiness. At one point during the evening, Marcus found himself standing next to the large window that looked out onto the forest. The trees were dusted with snow, beautiful in the winter moonlight. He thought about the night he had run into those woods, convinced that disappearing was the only option left to him. He had been so wrong. Patricia Williams appeared at his elbow, a cup of punch in her hand. "Quite a change from a few months ago, isn't it?" she said. Marcus nodded. "I still can't believe it's real sometimes. I keep expecting to wake up and find out it was all a dream." "It's not a dream, Marcus. This is your life now, and I have to say, it's been a privilege to watch it unfold." "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. "Of course. That night, when Jim said he wanted to foster me, did you think it would actually work out, or did you think he was just caught up in the moment?" Patricia was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "Honestly, I didn't know. I've seen a lot of people make promises in the heat of the moment that they couldn't keep, but there was something about Jim, about the way he looked at you, the conviction in his voice, that made me think this might be different. And I'm glad I trusted that instinct, because look at you now. You're thriving, Marcus. You're becoming the person you were always meant to be." Marcus smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for believing in it, for making it happen." "That's my job," Patricia replied. "But I have to say, this is one of the best outcomes I've ever been part of." Across the room, Jim was deep in conversation with Charlie Dawson and some of the other loggers. He caught Marcus's eye and raised his cup in a small salute, a gesture of connection across the crowded space. Marcus raised his own cup in return. Later that night, after the party had wound down and they had driven home through the snow-covered streets, Marcus and Jim sat together in front of the fireplace. The house was quiet, peaceful. Outside, the forest stood sentinel in the moonlight. "Dad?" Marcus said. "Yeah, son." "Thank you. For everything, for finding me, for taking me in, for wanting me." Jim put his arm around Marcus and pulled him close. "Thank you for letting me," he said. "You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing, a purpose, a reason to keep going. Ellen would have loved you, you know. She always wanted us to foster, but we never got around to it. I think she would be happy knowing that it finally happened." Marcus leaned into his father's embrace, feeling safe and warm and loved. "Do you think my birth mom would be happy too?" he asked quietly. "I think she would be proud of you," Jim replied, "and I think she would be grateful that you found a place where you belong." They sat there together as the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside, a father and son at the beginning of their story, surrounded by the warmth of everything they had built together. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were teenage rebellions to navigate, difficult conversations to have, moments when the scars of Marcus's early life rose to the surface and demanded attention. But through it all, the bond between Jim and Marcus remained strong, a foundation built on the night when 35 rough loggers walked into a dark forest to find a boy they had never met. Marcus excelled in school, graduating near the top of his class. He went on to college, then to a master's program in social work. He wanted, he said, to be for other children what Patricia Williams had been for him, an advocate, a believer, someone who saw potential where others saw problems. The loggers of Brennan Logging remained a constant presence in his life. Charlie Dawson walked him down the aisle at his wedding, standing in for the grandfather Marcus had never had. Pete Sullivan's kids became like cousins, gathering for holidays and summer barbecues. Danny Ortiz, who had eventually left Cedar Ridge to pursue his own dreams, always made time to catch up whenever he was in town. And Jim, Dad, was there for all of it, the graduations and the setbacks, the triumphs and the tears. He watched Marcus grow from a frightened 8-year-old into a confident young man with a heart as big as the forest that had once threatened to swallow him whole. On the 10th anniversary of that October night, the town of Cedar Ridge held a small commemoration. It wasn't a big production, just a gathering at the community church, a chance for people to remember what had happened and to reflect on how far they had all come. Marcus, now 18 and about to leave for college, stood before the assembled crowd and spoke about what that night had meant to him. 10 years ago, he said, I ran into the forest because I thought no one cared whether I lived or died. I thought I was invisible, worthless, a burden to everyone around me. I thought the world would be better off without me in it. He paused, looking out at the faces before him, the loggers who had searched for him, the teachers who had supported him, the community members who had rallied around a child they barely knew. I was wrong, he continued. I was so wrong, because when I was lost in those woods, cold and scared and alone, 35 men I had never met walked off their jobs and into the rain to find me. They didn't know my story, didn't know what I had been through. They just knew that a child was missing and needed help, and they came. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. What they did that night saved my life, not just because they found me before the cold took me, but because they showed me something I had never really believed before, that I mattered, that my life had value, that there were good people in the world who would show up for a stranger just because it was the right thing to do. He looked at Jim, who was sitting in the front row with tears streaming down his face. And then one of those men, the best man I have ever known, decided that finding me wasn't enough. He opened his home to me, and then his heart. He became my father in every way that matters. He taught me what family means, what love looks like, what it means to belong somewhere. Marcus wiped his own eyes, then smiled. I'm going to college next month. I'm going to study social work because I want to help kids like me, kids who have been through the system, kids who feel like they're invisible. I want to be for them what all of you were for me. I want to show them that they matter, that their lives have value, that there are people who will show up for them. He looked out at the crowd one more time. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for showing me what humanity looks like at its best. I will spend the rest of my life trying to live up to what you gave me that night. The applause that followed was long and loud, but Marcus barely heard it. He was too busy making his way to the front row, where Jim was waiting with open arms. I'm proud of you, son, Jim whispered as they embraced. I know, Dad, Marcus replied. I know. And in that moment, surrounded by the community that had saved him and the father who had chosen him, Marcus Carver knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The story of the foster boy and the 35 loggers became something of a legend in Cedar Ridge. It was told and retold, passed down through generations, a reminder of what was possible when ordinary people chose to act with extraordinary compassion. But for Marcus, it was never about the legend. It was about the quiet moments, the pancake breakfasts and the fishing trips, the movie nights and the long walks through the forest. It was about a big man with rough hands and a gentle heart who had decided, against all odds, that a lost boy was worth fighting for. It was about family. Not the family you're born into, but the family you find, the family you choose, the family that chooses you. And it was about hope, the stubborn, persistent hope that even in our darkest moments, even when we feel most alone, there are people who will come looking for us, people who will walk into the rain and the darkness, calling our name until they find us. Because everyone deserves to be found. Everyone deserves to be loved. Everyone matters. Years later, when Marcus had children of his own, 3 of them, all adopted from the foster care system, he would tell them this story. He would tell them about a night when he was lost and afraid, about the men who came to find him, about the father who gave him a home. And he would always end the same way. Never forget that you matter, he would say. Never forget that your life has value, and never ever give up hope. Because somewhere out there, someone is looking for you, someone is calling your name, and they will keep calling until they find you. It was a promise he had learned from a logger named Jim. in a small town called Cedar Ridge, on a cold October night when Love walked into the forest and refused to come back without him. And it was a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. The end of this story is really just a beginning. The beginning of a life that almost wasn't, of a family that shouldn't have been, of a community that discovered what it was capable of when it chose compassion over indifference. The forest behind Cedar Ridge still stands, ancient and eternal. The logging industry has changed, evolved, adapted to new realities. Many of the men who searched for Marcus that night have retired. Some have passed on. But their legacy lives on in the lives they touched, in the boy they saved, in the ripples of kindness that spread outward from one act of collective humanity. Jim Carver lived to see Marcus graduate from college, to hold his first grandchild, to watch the boy he had pulled from the forest become a man who spent his life pulling other children from their own dark places. He passed peacefully at the age of 78, surrounded by family, content in the knowledge that his life had mattered. At his funeral, Marcus spoke again, older now, his own hair touched with grey, but still carrying that same quiet strength that had seen him through so much. My father taught me that the measure of a person's life isn't found in what they accumulate, but in what they give away, Marcus said. He gave me his home, his heart, his name. He gave me the chance to become who I was meant to be. And in doing so, he showed me that the greatest thing any of us can do is to see someone who is lost and lonely and afraid, and to say, I see you. You matter. Let me help. He paused, looking out at the packed church, at the loggers and their children and their grandchildren, at the community that had embraced him and watched him grow, at the family he had built on the foundation of one man's extraordinary love. My father was not a perfect man. He would have been the first to tell you that. He was gruff and stubborn, and sometimes his jokes were terrible. But he had a heart as big as these mountains, and he used every beat of it to make the world a little better than he found it. That's all any of us can hope to do. Marcus looked at his wife, at his children, at the life that had grown from the ashes of abandonment and despair. Thank you, Dad, he said. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for keeping me. Thank you for showing me what love looks like. I will carry you with me for the rest of my days, and I will try, every day, to be the man you believed I could be. He stepped down from the pulpit, and the song began. An old hymn that had been Ellen's favorite, that had been sung at her funeral and would now be sung at Jim's, carrying them both into whatever came next. And as the music swelled and the tears flowed and the community gathered to say goodbye to one of its finest, the trees outside stood witness, as they had stood witness to everything. To a lost boy running into the darkness, to 35 men walking after him, to a father and son finding each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. The forest remembers everything, and if you listen closely, on quiet October nights, when the rain falls soft and the mist rises from the earth, you can almost hear the voices still echoing through the trees. Marcus, Marcus, can you hear me? We're here to help. The forest keeps calling, and somewhere someone is always listening. Somewhere someone is always willing to walk into the darkness to bring a lost child home. That is the legacy of Cedar Ridge. That is the legacy of 35 loggers who made a choice. That is the legacy of one small boy who learned against all odds that he was worth saving. And that legacy lives on, rippling outward through time and space, touching lives that will never know its origin, changing futures that have not yet been written. Because that's how love works. It doesn't stay contained. It spreads, it grows, it transforms everything it touches. One act of kindness becomes 2, becomes 10, becomes 1,000. One child saved becomes a family, becomes a community, becomes a movement. One choice to walk into the rain, to open your home, to say, I see you, you matter, can change everything. Everything. So if you're out there tonight feeling lost and alone, feeling like no one would notice if you disappeared, please know this. You matter. Your life has value. And somewhere someone is looking for you. They're calling your name even now. All you have to do is answer. All you have to do is let yourself be found. This has been the story of Marcus Carver and the 35 loggers who saved him. But really, it's a story about all of us, about what we're capable of when we choose to see each other, to help each other, to love each other. It's a story about hope, and it never really ends. It just keeps going and going and going. One act of kindness at a time. One life at a time. One love at a time. Forever. Thank you for being part of this story. Now go out and write your own. The world is waiting. And somewhere out there, someone is lost and afraid and hoping that help is on the way. Be that help. Be the voice in the forest. Be the one who doesn't give up. Because everyone deserves to be found. Everyone, even you, especially you. This is how we change the world, friends. Not with grand gestures or heroic sacrifices, but with small choices, daily kindnesses, the willingness to see and be seen. Jim Carver understood that. The loggers of Cedar Ridge understood that. Marcus Carver carries that understanding forward into every life he touches, every child he helps, every family he builds. And now you understand it too. So go. Go be the difference. Go be the hope. Go be the love that walks into the darkness and refuses to return empty-handed. The forest is waiting. The children are waiting. The future is waiting. And it all starts with you. Right here. Right now. This is how we heal the world. One found child at a time. Thank you for watching and thank you for caring. Until next time, remember, you matter, you are loved, and you are never, ever alone. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Goodbye for now, friends. And may your own forests always lead you home.